What Diego Pavia said about Deion Sanders has Colorado fans buzzing. When Diego Pavia sat down on the Pivot podcast with Ryan Clark, it wasn't supposed to turn into a moment that sent shockwaves through Boulder. But that's exactly what happened the moment he started talking about Deion Sanders. In an era where recruiting pitches are often wrapped in half-truths, vague promises, and glossy visions of stardom, Pavia's recollection cut through the noise with startling clarity. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't flattering in the traditional sense. But it was real, and that's precisely why Colorado fans haven't stopped buzzing since. Pavia, now a Vanderbilt quarterback and a legitimate Heisman Trophy finalist, took listeners back to a moment early in his journey, long before national spotlights and SEC Saturdays. Back then, Deion Sanders was still building his legacy at Jackson State, reshaping perceptions of HBCU football while laying the philosophical foundation that would later define his tenure at Colorado. Pavia was a talented quarterback prospect, hungry for opportunity, looking for a place where belief and development could intersect. When Sanders extended an offer, it came with something most recruits rarely hear: unfiltered truth. Coach Prime didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't dangle false hope or imply an open competition that didn't exist. He looked Pavia in the eye and told him exactly where he stood. The job belonged to his son. Not just the starting job, but the future of the program at quarterback. Even if Shedeur Sanders went down, Pavia wasn't jumping the line. For many coaches, that level of candor would feel like recruiting malpractice. For Deion Sanders, it was simply how he operates. Pavia's reaction said everything. Instead of feeling insulted or dismissed, he respected it. In his own words, he appreciated the honesty. At least he knew where he stood. At least his time wasn't being wasted. In a sport where dreams can be quietly crushed by unspoken depth chart realities, Sanders chose transparency over manipulation. That moment, years later, has come to symbolize what so many Colorado supporters believe separates Sanders from the rest. The irony, of course, is that Sanders' unwavering commitment to his son ultimately justified itself. Shedeur Sanders developed into the engine of a Colorado revival, first at Jackson State and then in Boulder. When Deion made the jump to the Pac-12, Shedeur followed, and together they helped transform a program that had been stuck in irrelevance. Colorado went from a one-win disaster to a nationally discussed brand in what felt like the blink of an eye. Wins came. Attention followed. The Buffaloes mattered again. Pavia's path took a different route, one that says just as much about resilience as it does about opportunity. Instead of waiting behind a depth chart he knew he'd never climb, he went to New Mexico State and carved out his own identity. He grew, matured, and learned how to lead. By the time he transferred to Vanderbilt, he wasn't just a quarterback looking for snaps. He was a polished competitor ready to elevate a program. In his second season with the Commodores, he did exactly that, guiding Vanderbilt to a stunning 10-2 record and placing his name firmly in the Heisman conversation. That context makes his words about Sanders even more powerful. This wasn't a bitter player looking back with regret. This was a successful quarterback acknowledging that the honesty he received early on allowed him to find the right path. It didn't derail his career. It may have saved it. For Colorado fans, Pavia's story reinforced a belief they've held since Sanders arrived: that the culture he's building is rooted in truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Recruiting under Sanders has been scrutinized relentlessly. Analysts point to fluctuating commitment numbers, aggressive transfer portal usage, and a willingness to cut players who don't meet his standards. Critics call it chaotic. Supporters call it clarity. Sanders doesn't sell illusions. Players who come to Colorado do so knowing exactly what is expected of them and, just as importantly, what is not promised. Roles are defined early. Opportunities must be earned. If a player doesn't fit the vision, Sanders won't pretend otherwise. That approach may cost him certain recruits, but it also attracts players who crave structure and honesty over empty hype. One of the defining elements of Colorado's roster-building strategy under Sanders has been his focus on immediate impact. He isn't interested in waiting 3 or 4 years for development if a player can't help right away. True freshmen are expected to compete. Transfers are brought in to play, not to sit quietly on the bench. That urgency reflects Sanders' belief that culture isn't built over time alone. It's built through accountability and performance. That accountability extends far beyond recruiting conversations. Sanders has shown repeatedly that no player, regardless of talent or status, is bigger than the program. The case of Amarian Miller became a defining example. Miller was Colorado's most productive wide receiver, leading the team in receiving yards and serving as a lifeline for an offense that often struggled to stay afloat. His playmaking ability kept games competitive even as losses piled up. Yet when Miller was late to a team meeting, Sanders didn't hesitate. He benched him. There were no exceptions, no star treatment, no quiet warnings swept under the rug. Sanders could have justified keeping his best weapon on the field, especially for a team desperate for wins. Instead, he chose principle over convenience. The message was unmistakable. Standards matter more than statistics. That moment resonated deeply within the program and with fans watching from the outside. It illustrated the same honesty Pavia described years earlier. Sanders wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine for the sake of appearances. He addressed issues directly, even when the short-term cost was painful. In his view, discipline isn't optional, and accountability is non-negotiable. The results on the field in 2025 were harsh. Colorado finished 3-9, a sobering reminder that culture alone doesn't guarantee wins. Injuries, depth issues, and inconsistency exposed the fragile foundation still being constructed. Critics were quick to pounce, questioning whether Sanders' methods could truly sustain success at the Power 5 level. But within the losses, there were signs of something deeper taking root. Players didn't quit. Effort didn't disappear. Young talent gained experience under pressure. Sanders continued to speak with the same blunt honesty that defined his recruiting pitches, refusing to hide from criticism or shift blame. He acknowledged shortcomings publicly, challenged his roster, and doubled down on his belief that truth is the fastest path to growth. That is why Pavia's comments struck such a chord. They weren't just a nostalgic anecdote. They were a validation of Sanders' philosophy. In a sport obsessed with optics, Sanders operates with a level of transparency that feels almost radical. He tells players when they won't play. He benches stars when they break rules. He rebuilds rosters without apology. And he accepts the consequences when results don't immediately follow. For Colorado fans, that honesty represents hope. Not blind optimism, but belief in a process that prioritizes integrity over illusion. The path back to national relevance won't be smooth. It will require smarter recruiting, better depth, and continued development at key positions. It will demand patience from a fan base energized by early flashes but sobered by recent setbacks. Sanders knows that. He's never pretended otherwise, and that, more than any viral clip or bold statement, may be his greatest strength. As Pavia's story reminds everyone watching, sometimes the most powerful pitch a coach can make isn't a promise of glory, but the courage to tell the truth and let players decide if they're strong enough to handle it.